Well, I guess better late than never, am I right? Finally, McLaren, you're delivering on the big promises you made at the start of the year. These upgrades are really working a treat. Watching Lando consistently gap around 2/10 to half a second on Lewis through Maggots and Beckett's was unreal. I believed that McLaren would, at some point, be fighting towards the front end of the midfield from time to time, but never would I have envisioned them making this much progress in such a short period of time. Mika Hakkinen was genuinely serious about them challenging Red Bull. As of the British Grand Prix, they have the second fastest car on the grid. It's not by a lot though. The advantage has been dicing back and forth between three different teams, and only recently has McLaren entered the scene. Let's throw back to the start of the season in Bahrain, when McLaren had a disaster. Lando ended up being lapped twice by Verstappen, and Piastri didn't even make it to the checkered flag. I vented my frustrations in a video made just after the Grand Prix, because their performance was pretty embarrassing. But deep down, I still somewhat believed in Andrea Stella's promise that the pain was only temporary and would pay off later down the line. Now I want to share some race pace data with you guys to show you who's been best of the rest behind Red Bull from race to race, and also put into perspective just how much progress McLaren have made. Just to be crystal clear, I've taken averages for the fastest driver for each team from the Fast F1 Python API, which automatically filters out outlier laps, so it's as representative as possible. And if you're into that kind of stuff, you can check out the code for yourself and play around with the data. Also, for the numbers that aren't representative or require context, then I will include that in my analysis. So let's start with Bahrain. Aston were the fastest, followed by the Mercedes of Hamilton, then Ferrari. However, given the fact that Charles' engine decided to take the day off, I had to take Sainz's average lap times, which were a lot slower. Therefore, the ranking after round 1 in reality was Aston, Ferrari, then Mercedes. Okay? Cool. Now for Jeddah. This is the first race we can include McLaren, as they weren't plagued by unreliability, but they still struggled massively. Again, Aston were clear, followed by Mercedes this time, then Ferrari. McLaren, however, were over a second a lap slower than those three. In Australia, it was Ferrari who had fractionally the better race pace, but as they were starting out of position, they couldn't maximise it. Mercedes and Aston were pretty much identical, but I'd argue that Alonso's pace was being limited given the fact that he was pressurising Hamilton all race long in an attempt to force him into a mistake. Also, since it's so hard to overtake around Albert Park, he wasn't able to do much other than follow him to P3, but he definitely had extra pace in hand. McLaren were a little bit better this time around, being just 4/10 off the pace. Moving on to Baku, Ferrari were up there again as the quickest behind Red Bull, followed closely by Aston Martin, with Mercedes another 4/10 back. McLaren, their race pace dropped off relative to these guys, as they were once again over a second a lap slower. Miami was the same story, only this time Mercedes were quicker than Ferrari. In Monaco, Aston were over a second a lap faster than Merc and the Scuderia, but context needs to be added. Alpine were third with Ocon for a majority of the race, so their pace was hindered due to being stuck behind him. In free air, they likely would have been quicker. And you'll notice this is a recurring theme. Qualifying is infinitely more important when you're fighting amongst a group of similarly matched cars. Overtaking in a race where the pace differential is smaller is a lot harder, especially considering some cars are now affected by dirty air more than others. Right now, the Red Bull and McLaren seem to be the most error efficient in that respect, given that they can follow cars more closely without struggling with turbulence like, say, Ferrari or Mercedes for example. But we'll come back to this point a bit later. Looking at Spain, it was all Mercedes, as they were well clear of their rivals. But what's interesting is McLaren's race pace wasn't too bad. Had Lando not had that contact at the start, I reckon they could have squeezed maybe a point or two out of that car. Then in Canada, the Aston was the fastest out of the three in race trim, followed by Merc, then Ferrari. And after Austria, McLaren's comeback officially began. They were on level terms with Aston Martin and just a couple tenths behind Ferrari. Mercedes, on the other hand, were pretty much nowhere. Silverstone proved to be an even better fairing for the working team, as they were the fastest out of the four and by some margin too. The car just looks a lot more alive now with these upgrades. I mentioned a few months ago that I wanted to see real progress made with their in-season development, and they've not disappointed. What they said about finding a different development direction at the end of last year has proved to be fruitful in the long run. I guess we just needed a bit of patience. Now they can consistently challenge towards the front end of the field again. It'll be interesting to see how this four-way battle plays out. Lando has already proven to be an exceptional talent. The way he was defending against Lewis on that safety car restart was absolutely phenomenal. He always left enough racing room, never once outbraked himself or ran off track to maintain a position. Just straight up, clean wheel-to-wheel racing, which is what we want to see. The thing that really saved him though was the car's performance through maggots and Beckett's. If we take a look at the data trace between Hamilton, Russell and Norris on their quickest qualifying runs, we can see that both Mercs were actually ahead before they got to that sequence of corners. But the McLaren was just able to pull clear mostly through Beckett's and on the exit of Stowe. For some reason, the Mercedes has lost its trademark high-speed performance, but maybe that'll come back with future upgrades. I also want to give a big shout out to Oscar freaking Piastri. This kid is something special, and I actually need to make a separate video talking about him at some point. He didn't even have the full raft of upgrades for the weekend, yet he was able to keep close tabs with his extremely high caliber teammate all weekend. Slowly by slowly, he's building confidence in that car and in himself. And I don't want to jump the gun, but I have a feeling that if he continues on this trajectory, he could be outperforming Lando on a consistent basis. He got very unlucky with the safety car, but that happens in racing. I'm certain that this won't be his last opportunity and he'll get that first podium very soon. McLaren's sudden surge in performance has been reminiscent of Aston Martin's over the winter break. They found the correct development path midway through last year, but haven't seen the same progress in season. Now, I think part of the reason why they've had a few off weekends is due to track characteristics. Generally, their car is quite draggy and has performed well on rail limited circuits and in low to medium speed corners. However, as other teams have brought upgrades and closed the gap, Aston haven't really been able to keep up. I do expect them to be much stronger at the next round in Hungary though, given it'll suit their car's characteristics much better. Will we see them challenge the Red Bulls as they said? Probably not, given they are also bringing upgrades which, if they weren't already out of reach, will certainly put them there. But hey, we've got a fascinating battle brewing between 4 different teams for the rest of the season. Me personally, I think that's something to be excited about. Ferrari have had a pretty tumultuous season so far. In terms of one lap pace, I don't think there's any doubt they've been the second fastest for most of the season, but they've rarely translated that into race trim. Only on 2 occasions in Baku and Austria have they done this. Other times, like Canada or even Jeddah, where Leclerc was given a grid drop, they've been out of position at the start, which has often compromised their race pace. The up and down nature of this car has proven to be tricky for their drivers to handle, let alone all the poor strategy calls they've made on top of that. It's hard to get their car into the right operating window, but whenever they do, it's very competitive. The same could be said about Mercedes, who have now been surpassed by 2 out of their 3 customer teams. However, considering they only just switched to a completely different concept recently, I'd wait to see what more they have to offer. Overall, both drivers have complained about rear instability. The car just constantly looks like a handful to drive, but you have to tip your hat out to George and Lewis for absolutely maximizing everything out of their package every single weekend. And in some instances, they've over-delivered and capitalized well on the misfortunes of others. As it stands, they're currently second in the Constructors and 4th in the Drivers' Championship with Lewis. Once they get on top of their issues in qualifying, they can put themselves in a prime position to maximize their race pace, which has always been very strong. The field spread of the upper midfield at the moment just goes to show that these new regulations can work. Performance is slowly converging. We just need these teams to now outdevelop Red Bull, so, we can maybe get a 5-way fight. But that's way easier said than done. And if we're being honest, for a team like Mercedes, Aston Martin and McLaren are proof that if you get it right, you can make huge strides. So there's really no excuse for them not to catch Red Bull at some point this year or next. But right now, watch out for these inter-team battles for the rest of the season. I'm excited for more Hamilton versus Alonso. I'm excited to see how Piastri fares against Norris once he gets all the upgrades. I'm excited to see Ferrari, well, maybe not Ferrari actually. But yeah, generally, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. Not to mention Williams, who are now consistently knocking on the door of top 10 finishes with Alpine. Behind Red Bull, it's all extremely close, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it all plays out. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, be sure to drop a like, share this video around with friends, and subscribe to the channel with bell notifications to keep up to date with my latest videos in the future. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.